All right, guys. So we've been working through kind of civil rights in America, and right now we're kind of on the 1960s and the African American pursuit of civil rights. And I want to read to you guys one of my favorite speeches, an excerpt from Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. And so, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech has a lot of rich content in it. But what are some things that you guys, just from the short excerpt of the passage, kind of can bring out about, the civil rights movement, about what Martin Luther King felt about the situation? Any thoughts, any comments?
He looked forward to a day of justice.
Look forward to a day of justice. That's good. Anyone else?
He didn't want his kids to live in the system that he was living in.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, that gives a lot of. It's really personal. It feels really like what he wants what he is kind of striving for. I mean, it's called "I Have a Dream." He has a dream, and so this kind of gives us evidence to what kind of historical document this speech is. It's a primary source. It brings out the personal. It brings out a first-hand account of the situation. So using kind of the broad definition of first-hand account for a primary source, could you think of any other examples of what a primary source could be?
Kobe Bryant in his game against the Knicks.
Kobe Bryant in his game against the Knicks. Well, an account of a historical event. So, if there's a recording of Kobe, if you're writing a research paper on Kobe Bryant's best moments in basketball, and you get a video of his performance against the Knicks, that'd be a perfect primary source. So we have a video, we have speech, we have recordings of the events, so you can get recordings and other things. These are all examples of primary sources. Other great example would be an autobiography. Would be a great one because it gives a first-hand account of how a person lived their life through different certain situation. Those are all great examples of primary sources, and they all tend to go into the same definition of primary sources. Being a first-hand account, being right there with the time period that it's talking about. Another kind of example of a primary source would be data from the time period, because that's also, while it's not a personal account, it is a first-hand account of what's going on during the time period. So census data from the 1960s and how many African Americans there were in the United States would be a good example of things we can learn about the civil rights movement. And now that we know kind of some examples of primary sources, kind of some definition of what it is, we kind of go to the flip side. And what is a secondary source? So with a primary source being a first-hand account, what do you think a secondary source would be?
Documentaries on the Middle Ages.
Documentary on that's a great example. And because it's a commentary, it's kind of research surrounding first-hand events. That would be a great example. So you couldn't technically say a movie like Gladiator would be a secondary source, but if you had a fact-based documentary on the Middle Ages and on what's going on at the time, that'd be a perfect example of a secondary source. Any other examples?
A book that was written later?
Yeah, a book that was written later, a book that was written by a historian's perspective of the events that happened. And so those are both great examples, and they kind of lead us to the definition of a secondary source as being something that tells us about a time period from an outsider looking in. And so it's a lot of times a secondary source is not a first-hand account, but is instead kind of a reflection of the time period, a reflection of what was going on. And so we have documentaries We have books written by historians. We have research papers. Those are all great examples of secondary sources and how they're used. And one of the things when we're writing research papers about a specific event, it's important to use both primary and secondary sources. Because secondary sources, the books written by historians, documentaries, they use a lot of primary sources within the secondary source. So a lot of times when looking at writing a research paper about a specific time period, about events, you want to balance out and you want to get the first-hand accounts so you have a good perspective and good evidence of what is going on in the time period, but also some good secondary sources because they might have been able to gather more primary sources than you would have been able to in your research process, and they can kind of point you to other primary sources and give you a broader perspective of the time period so that you can narrow down and focus on what you want to focus on. So primary and secondary sources are extremely helpful in our process of writing research papers and what we want to do. And with that, we'll talk more about primary and secondary sources in future days to come. But right now I want to ask you guys if you have any questions about primary, secondary sources, how to use them in a paper. Any questions? All right, good. It's good to have you guys in class today, and class dismissed. All right, I want to teach you guys today how to do a timeline, but I don't just want to teach you the normal way. I want to teach you Beastie Boys style. Let's lay down a beat. I am here to teach you how to do a timeline, so you can know history and feel so fine. First step, pick your topic, something cool, so it can be a helpful tool. Then you do some research and find some events, like the Great Depression and the Hooverville Tents. Find out when it happened, the exact date. Make sure you have it right, you don't want to be late or early. Lastly, take everything, make sure it lines up. And when you are done, yell out,